The morning my son's new wife dropped my retirement gift into the recycling bin at their housewarming party. I watched her laugh and say, "Oh, this is just an old envelope. Probably a card with a check for $50. She didn't even open it. She just held it up for everyone to see, rolled her eyes, and set it on top of a pile of crumpled wrapping paper, like it was nothing. What Tanya didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that inside that envelope was a certified copy of the title to the lakeside cottage in Muskoka. I had spent 11 years quietly paying off. Fully owned. No mortgage. Worth just over $430,000. And within 48 hours, she would learn exactly what she had dismissed. But by then, I had already made my decision. My name is June Whitfield, and I am 63 years old. I'm telling you this story not because I want sympathy, and not because I want to celebrate anyone's humiliation. I'm telling you because I believe in the power of a lesson learned honestly, even when it comes wrapped in pain. My husband, Roy, died 11 years ago. A stroke, sudden and without warning, on a Thursday afternoon in October, while he was raking leaves in our backyard in Barrie, Ontario. Our neighbor found him. I was still at the hospital finishing a shift in occupational therapy when I got the call. I remember sitting in the parking lot afterward for almost an hour. Unable to drive. Unable to move. Unable to understand how the world could keep running when the person holding it together for me had simply stopped. Our son, Daniel, was 22 at the time. He had just finished his second year of a civil engineering program at the University of Waterloo. The days after Roy's death were the hardest I have ever lived through. But I had a child, and that meant I had no choice but to keep going. For the next decade, I worked. I worked long hours. I picked up evening shifts. I applied for every overtime rotation my department offered. I drove the same car for 9 years. I stopped going out for dinner. I canceled cable, switched phone plans, brought lunch from home every single day. Not because I was poor. Roy's life insurance helped cover the immediate debt. But because I had made a private decision that nobody around me knew about. Roy and I had owned a small cottage on a lake north of Gravenhurst. We bought it together in the early years of our marriage, before Daniel was born. It was nothing spectacular. A 2-bedroom A-frame with a screened porch and a cracked dock that Roy spent 3 summers threatening to repair. But we loved that place more than almost anything we owned. We spent every long weekend there. Canada Day, Victoria Day, Thanksgiving, summers when Daniel was small. It was the place where Roy taught Daniel to fish. The place where I read every novel I have ever loved. The place where Roy and I used to sit on the dock after dinner and watch the sun go down over the water without saying a single word to each other, because we didn't need to. When Roy died, the cottage still had a mortgage on it, a manageable one, but a real one. The insurance paid off the house in Barrie. The cottage I decided to keep paying myself, every month, quietly, without telling Daniel, without telling anyone. My plan was simple, and it never wavered. When Daniel eventually built a life of his own, the cottage would be his. Paid off, debt-free, a place where he could start his own family, where grandchildren could someday run down that same dock, where something of Roy could live on. That was the plan. I never doubted it. Daniel grew into a man his father would have been deeply proud of. Patient, thoughtful, the kind of person who noticed when someone needed help and simply helped them without making a production of it. He finished his engineering degree, found work with a municipal planning firm in Oakville, and called me every Sunday without fail. Some Sunday calls lasted 5 minutes. Some lasted an hour and a half. But he always called. That mattered to me more than I ever told him. About 3 years ago, Daniel came to visit for Thanksgiving weekend. On the Sunday morning, while I was frying eggs, he cleared his throat from the kitchen doorway in the particular way he always had when he was nervous about something. "Mom," he said, "I've been seeing someone." I put the spatula down. "How long?" 8 months. I turned around. 8 months, Daniel. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. I wanted to make sure it was real first. Her name was Tanya Osgood. She was 31, a few years younger than Daniel, and she worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. The first time I met her was at a restaurant in Oakville, a place I'd never heard of that turned out to cost more person than I spent on groceries in a week. Tanya arrived in a coat that I later learned was a mackage. She had the kind of confidence that fills a room before the person wearing it has finished walking through the door. I tried to be open. I reminded myself that first impressions are complicated, that nervousness sometimes looks like arrogance, that I was meeting my son's girlfriend for the first time, and my job was simply to show up with goodwill. And for the first half of that dinner, it seemed to be working. Tanya was sharp. She asked intelligent questions, laughed easily, seemed genuinely interested in Daniel in a way that was good to see. But somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, something shifted. She had been describing a property deal she'd recently closed, a large commercial space in the distillery district, and I made the mistake of mentioning that Roy and I had once looked at a small investment property when Daniel was young, but decided against it because the timing wasn't right. Tanya looked at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's probably for the best," she said. "The Toronto market back then was tricky if you didn't know what you were doing." It wasn't the words. It was the tone. The faint suggestion that Roy and I had been out of our depth, that people like us operated in a different category from people like her. I let it go. I smiled. I changed the subject, but I noticed it. Over the next 2 years, as Daniel and Tanya's relationship deepened, I kept noticing. She commented once on the age of my car, in a way that was framed as concern, but felt like criticism. She called my Barrie neighborhood quiet, which in her mouth sounded like the opposite of a compliment. She would sometimes glance around my kitchen with an expression I came to recognize. A quick survey, a small suppression of something, that made me feel as though I and everything I had built was being assessed and filed away under the category of insufficient. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself Roy's death had made me read too much into things. I told myself that Tanya was a city woman with a fast career who communicated differently than I did, and that none of it was personal. Then one evening I overheard something I was never supposed to hear. Daniel and Tanya had come to Barrie for a weekend visit. I had stepped outside to get something from my car and was walking back up the driveway when I heard their voices through the open kitchen window. They didn't know I was there. Tanya was talking. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, the way she sounded when she was explaining something obvious. "I'm just saying," she said, "that your mom's world and ours are going to be pretty different. That's all." Daniel said something I couldn't make out. "I'm not being mean about it," Tanya continued. "She's sweet. It's just, we're building a certain kind of life, and I think it's important that we're both clear about that." I stood in the driveway for a moment. Then I went back to my car, sat in it for 10 minutes, and came inside through the front door, making enough noise that they heard me coming. I said nothing. I served dinner. I was perfectly pleasant all weekend. But something had quietly closed inside me. Daniel proposed to Tanya the following spring. He called me the same evening, voice barely containing itself. I was genuinely happy for him, because I loved my son, and he was happy, and happiness matters. But I also began quietly reconsidering things. My friend Barb Thornton, who had known me and Roy for 30 years and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive, met me for coffee the week after the engagement was announced. I told her everything. The comments, the tone, what I'd heard through the window, all of it. Barb listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at me carefully. "Are you still planning to give them the cottage? I've been asking myself that every day for the past month." And I was quiet for a moment. "I think I am, but not because Tanya deserves it, because Daniel does." Barb nodded slowly. "Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. I'm doing it because Roy and I always wanted Daniel to have it. That hasn't changed." Barb studied me. "All right then," she picked up her coffee. "But I want it on record that I think you should at least tell him beforehand. I want it to be a surprise." She sighed in the particular way Barb sighs when she thinks I'm being stubborn. "Okay, but I'm coming to the party." The housewarming party was scheduled for late September, a few months after the wedding. Daniel and Tanya had moved into a new build in Oakville, a beautiful home that Tanya had found and essentially designed around her own specifications. I visited once before the party. The house was stunning. Clean lines, high ceilings, everything in shades of white and warm gray. It looked exactly like a magazine. I arranged for our family lawyer, a woman named Andrea Sutherland, who had handled Roy's estate and several matters for me since, to prepare the transfer documents. The plan was for the cottage to transfer to Daniel and Tanya jointly after the housewarming, a gift to mark the beginning of their life together in their new home. Andrea had everything ready. The certified title, the transfer forms, a letter of explanation. All of it went into a plain white envelope. I remember standing at my kitchen table, the morning of the party, looking at that envelope. 11 years of monthly mortgage payments. 11 years of choosing the cheaper option, the longer road, the extra shift. Every decision had been pointed at this moment. I drove to Oakville. The party was full, 40 or 50 people, maybe more. Colleagues of Daniel's, Tanya's friends from the city, a few relatives from both sides. The house looked even more polished with people in it. Tanya moved through the rooms in a way that made it clear. She had rehearsed the whole thing, which guest would stand where, which conversation she would anchor, which moment would be photographed. I stayed close to Barb for most of the evening. We watched. We ate the very good food. We talked to Daniel's aunt, a woman named Millicent Osgood, who had driven down from Collingwood and who I noticed also seemed to stand slightly outside the radius of Tanya's warmth. The gift portion of the evening came after dinner. Tanya had organized it. Gifts opened publicly, a little bit of theater. Daniel sat beside her on a bench near the fireplace. One by one, people brought things forward. When my turn came, I walked over slowly. I handed Daniel the envelope. He looked at it, then at me. "Mom, you didn't have to. Open it later," I said. "When things have settled down." But Tanya was already reaching for it. She took the envelope from Daniel's hands lightly, almost reflexively, the way she handled most things, with the assumption that it naturally belonged to her. She turned it over. She looked at the front. There was nothing written on it except Daniel's name in my handwriting. She smiled at the room. "Let's see what we have here." She said it in the tone of someone who already knew the answer. She held it up briefly, weighing it in her palm. Then she looked at me with that smile. "This feels like a card," she said, not cruelly, just plainly. As though she were identifying the type of thing it was before deciding how much attention it deserved. A few people chuckled politely. "It might be," I said. She set it on the edge of the coffee table without opening it, next to a stack of open gift wrap. "We'll look at all the cards together later." Then she turned back to the room and called for the next gift. Daniel glanced at me. I kept my expression still. 20 minutes later, as the gathering was beginning to wind down, and people drifted toward the kitchen for dessert, I watched Tanya collecting the used wrapping paper and gift bags into a large recycling bag. She moved efficiently around the table. Tissue paper, ribbon, torn envelopes, things that were clearly garbage. And then, without pausing, without a second glance, she picked up my envelope and dropped it into the bag. I don't think she even registered what she was doing. It had already been classified. Barb was beside me. I felt her go very still. I stood up quietly. I walked to where Tanya was standing. She looked up, mildly surprised. "That's mine," I said. I reached into the recycling bag and retrieved the envelope. Tanya frowned slightly. "Oh, the card? Sorry, I thought that was part of the..." "It's fine." I put the envelope in my handbag. "Have a lovely rest of your evening." I found Daniel in the kitchen. I hugged him. I told him the house was beautiful, that I was proud of him, that I loved him. He looked at me with an expression that asked whether something had happened. I smiled and said I was just tired from the drive. Then I drove back to Barry. I sat at Roy's kitchen table. I still call it that. I probably always will. And I opened the envelope. I looked at the transfer documents for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Andrea Sutherland. She answered on the third ring. "Andrea, I need to put the transfer on hold." A pause. "What happened?" I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Okay." Her voice was professional and kind at once. "I'll hold everything. Call me when you're ready to talk next steps." After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark kitchen. Outside, the maples along the back fence had already turned. October was close. I thought about Roy raking leaves in this same yard. I thought about the cottage, the dock, the water at dusk. I thought about Daniel as a small boy learning to identify constellations from the screened porch while Roy pointed and named each one. I wasn't angry exactly. I was some closer to sad and very, very clear. Barb called at 9:30. Are you home? Yes. The envelope. She stopped herself. She didn't know what was in it, I said. She thought it was a card. I know. A beat. But Susan, she caught herself. Sorry, June. But you would have opened it. Anyone who cared would have opened it. I didn't answer, because she was right. The following morning I woke early, made tea, and sat on my back step watching the light come up over the neighborhood. My phone showed 4 missed calls from Daniel, all after 11 p.m., and 2 texts. I hadn't heard any of them. I'd slept more soundly than I had in weeks, which surprised me. The texts from Daniel read, Mom, can you call me when you get a chance? And then, 20 minutes later, Please, Mom. The urgency told me Barb had told him something, or he had figured something out on his own. I called him back at 7:30. He answered immediately. Mom, his voice was tight. Good morning. Barb called me last night. He was trying to sound calm and not succeeding. She said you retrieved an envelope from the recycling bag. I did. A long pause. What was in it? I took a breath. The title to the cottage. Fully transferred to you and Tanya. No mortgage remaining. The silence that followed was long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. The cottage, he said finally. His voice had changed entirely. I've been paying the mortgage since your father died. It's been clear for 14 months. Andrea had the transfer paperwork ready. I was going to give it to you last night. Another silence. Mom, you don't have to say anything right now. Mom, His voice broke. Just slightly, just for a second, the way it did when he was trying to hold something together. I'm so sorry. This wasn't your fault. She didn't know. I know she didn't. If I had seen her, I would have said something. I didn't see it happen. I know, Daniel. More silence. I could hear him breathing. Outside, a blue jay landed on the fence post and tilted its head at me. Can I come see you? He asked. Whenever you're ready. He came that afternoon. Alone. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and kept his hands around his coffee cup without drinking from it, which was a habit he had inherited directly from Roy, and which always caught me off guard. We talked for a long time. Not about the cottage. Or not only about the cottage. We talked about Roy. About the years after. About the things I had done quietly and never mentioned. He knew I had kept the cottage payments going. He had assumed, as children often assume, that it simply required less than it did. The grief on his face was not about losing a property. It was about understanding, retroactively, what the years had actually looked like from my side. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? He asked. Because I didn't do it for credit, I said. I did it because I wanted to. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens now? Nothing has to happen immediately. He looked at me carefully. Are you going to tell Tanya what was in the envelope? She'll find out, I said. Whether I tell her or not. He knew I was right. In small family circles, these things always come out. It came out 2 days later. Barb told me the chain of events afterward. Daniel had gone home after visiting me. He had sat down with Tanya and tried to explain everything carefully, the way he approached most difficult things. Methodically, without accusation. He told her about the cottage, about the mortgage, about the transfer documents, about what my visit to the recycling bag had meant. Tanya's first reaction, according to Daniel, was to go very still. Her second reaction was to say, Where is the envelope now? Daniel told her I had it. Her third reaction, and this is the one that mattered, was not to ask whether I was all right, or whether he was all right, or to say anything about the years of sacrifice behind the gift. Her third reaction was to ask whether the transfer could still go through. Daniel said he didn't know. She said she thought they should call me. He said he needed some time to think. They argued, apparently, for most of that evening. Not loudly. Tanya rarely raised her voice. I had noticed that. She made her points in the measured tones of someone who had learned that calmness gives you the appearance of reason, regardless of whether you are being reasonable. But Daniel had inherited something of Roy's stubbornness, the kind that looks mild until it doesn't move. He called me the following morning. His voice was tired. She wants to come see you, he said, to apologize. I let that sit for a moment. Does she understand what she's apologizing for? A long pause. I'm not sure. That honesty, was the most important thing he'd said to me all week. Tanya called me herself that evening. The conversation was brief. She said she was deeply sorry about what had happened at the party. She said she hadn't realized the envelope was significant. She said she would love the chance to speak with me in person. I listened to everything she said. Then I told her she was welcome to come for coffee on Saturday morning. When Tanya arrived, she was alone. That surprised me, and I noted it as something in her favor. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at me directly. I want to start by saying I'm sorry, she said. What I did was careless and disrespectful. I nodded. Tell me something, Tanya. She waited. Do you know what you're sorry for? She blinked. For dismissing your gift. For not taking the time to. Before you knew what was in the envelope, I said. Before anyone told you. She seemed confused for a moment, then she understood the question. You're asking whether I would be sitting here if the envelope had contained a card. I'm asking what you think. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. To her credit, she didn't pretend. I don't know, she said quietly. I'd like to think so, but I don't know. I appreciated the honesty enough to stay with it. That's a hard thing to admit. Yes, she looked down at the table. My father used to say that the people who are easiest to dismiss are often the ones who are giving you the most. Your father sounds like a thoughtful man. He is. A pause. I've been thinking about that a lot this week. We talked for a while after that. Not easily, not warmly, not yet. Those things take time, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But we talked honestly, which was more than I had expected. At one point she said something that surprised me. I think I've spent a lot of years judging people by the wrong things, she said. And I didn't realize how completely I'd done it until I saw your face at the party. She looked at me. When you walked over to that bag, the way you reached in, you weren't angry. You were just quiet. And that was worse, somehow. I didn't respond to that directly, but I heard it. When she left, I sat on the porch for a long time. The maples were at their peak now, red and gold all the way to the road. Roy had always said October in Barrie was the most beautiful month anywhere in the country, and he had not been wrong. I thought about the cottage, about what I was going to do with it. I called Andrea the following week. Still on hold, she asked. Still on hold, I said. But I want to talk about something different. What I had been turning over in my mind all week was this. Daniel deserved the cottage. That had been true since Roy died, and nothing that had happened changed it. But a joint transfer, that felt wrong now. Not as punishment, just as clarity. Because a gift that significant needed to land somewhere solid, and solid ground was still being found. Andrea and I spoke for over an hour. She walked me through the options carefully, which is why I've trusted her for 12 years. In the end, I transferred the cottage to Daniel alone. I called him to tell him. He was quiet for a long time. Mom, you don't have to. I know, Tanya and I are. I know how things stand, I said gently. This is for you. It's what your dad and I always wanted. What happens within your marriage is between you and Tanya, and that's not my business. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. Thank you. You don't need to thank me, I said. Just to take your kids up there someday and teach them where the good fishing spots are. He laughed. It sounded a little like Roy. The legal transfer completed on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. I drove up to Muskoka the following weekend alone, parked at the end of the gravel road, and walked down to the dock. The lake was silver in the November light. The trees were bare. The old boards of the dock were still solid. Daniel had replaced several of them the previous summer, without being asked. I stood there for a while. The story that people hear is about a gift that was dropped in a recycling bag. That's the part that's easy to tell, the part with a clear moment of conflict and a clear moment of consequence. But that was never what the story was really about. It was about 11 years of early mornings and late shifts, about a man raking leaves on a Thursday afternoon who never came back inside, about a son who called every Sunday for a decade because he understood, on some level, that Sundays were hard. about what it means to give something to someone, not so they'll admire you for it, but simply because you love them and you want them to have it. Tanya and Daniel are still married. I don't say that as a fairy tale ending. Marriage is not a fairy tale, and I've lived long enough to know better. They've done some work, the kind that happens in an office with a third person present and a box of tissues on the table. Some weeks are better than others. But Daniel seems more settled in himself lately, which matters to me. Tanya and I have had coffee a handful of times. It is still not easy. I don't expect it to be. Ease between people who have hurt each other takes years to build, not months, and there's no shortcut that I've ever found. But there is something different about her now. A quality of listening she didn't have before. She asks questions instead of making assessments. She leaves room in conversations for other people to occupy. People can change. I believe that. I have changed myself in ways I didn't expect and couldn't have predicted in the years since Roy died. Grief changes you. Loneliness changes you. So does sitting on a dock in November, watching the light go flat across the water. The cottage is Daniel's now. He and Tanya have been up twice since the transfer, once in February with the snowshoes we used to keep in the shed, and once in July. He texted me a photograph from that July trip. The dock, the water, a sky the exact shade of blue that Roy always said you only got north of the city. I have that photograph on my phone and I look at it sometimes on the hard days. The envelope is still in my desk drawer. I keep it there not as a reminder of what went wrong, but as a reminder of what I know about myself. That I am the kind of person who plans quietly, who works without announcement, who gives from a place that has nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with love. Roy knew that about me. Daniel knows it now. That is enough. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you've ever given something that wasn't seen for what it was, or if you've been on the other side of that and had to face it honestly, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there. I read every single one.